Now I'd like to discuss the impeachment issue. In the fall of 2006, Chairman John Conyers of the House Judiciary Committee wrote an article in the Washington Post saying if the Democrats won in November, there would be no impeachment resolution. There would be a bipartisan impeachment inquiry. I couldn't believe what he was writing. I mean, he's going to get Republicans to join a bipartisan impeachment inquiry? That was the first sign that the Democrats were taking off the table the most multiply, chronically, repeatedly, defiantly impeachable president and vice president in American history. Over 1 million people have signed a petition demanding impeachment for just one citizen group. I wrote Chairman Conyers a letter. I've known him for years. I admire him for his civil rights work, his voting record, sterling. Whether it's the pressure of Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer, the top 1 or 2 Democrats in the House, who had stated after they won the congressional election in 2006 that impeachment was off the table. Why, it would be distracting. How do you like that? It would be distracting to hold a criminal recidivist White House accountable under Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution that those members of Congress are sworn to uphold. The House moved to impeach Nixon. He resigned just before the vote because he was charged with obstructing justice on a burglary in the Watergate apartment complex where the Democratic National Committee had offices. Bill Clinton was impeached for lying under oath about sex. George W. Bush and Dick Cheney have brought our republic down from any constitutional perspective. They have destroyed, by violating our Constitution, our statutes, our treaties. They have destroyed any semblance that they are beneath the law, within the law. They have demonstrated to the American people that every day they're in office, they can violate so many legal standards and do so defiantly, like spying on Americans without judicial warrant, and get away with it. Unless the American people become serious about their Constitution, succeeding presidents are going to have a terrible precedent to do much of the same. In my letter to Chairman Conyers, I made the following. Prominent constitutional law experts believe President Bush has engaged in at least 5 categories of repeated, defiant, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors, end quote. That's from Article 2, Section 4. Which separately or together would allow Congress to subject the President to impeachment under that Article 2, Section 4 of our Constitution. The sworn oath of members of Congress is to uphold the Constitution. Failure of the members of Congress to pursue impeachment of President Bush is an affront to the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, and the people of the United States. The Founding Fathers put that impeachment clause in there because they did not want another runaway King George. What an irony. We now have a King George IV who thinks he can do anything, anytime, as long as he drapes the mantle of national security in opposition to terrorism. But that's what dictators have done all the time around the world. It's the same old story of how they use these symbols to escape the rule of law. How many times have you heard no person should be above the law? That includes the president. Here are the 5 categories. They're not lying under oath about sex. They're not obstructing justice in a burglary in downtown Washington. In addition to a criminal war of aggression in Iraq, in violation of our Constitution, statutes, and international treaties, like the Geneva Conventions, there are the arrests of thousands of Americans and their imprisonment without charges. You just don't do that in a country that's dedicated to the right of habeas corpus. He did it. The spying on Americans without judicial warrant. 3. 4. Systemic torture. It's now quite clear that the systemic torture orders started at the top in the White House with Bush and Cheney. The New York Times had an editorial recently discussing the release of an 81-page memo by a Pentagon lawyer under the Freedom of Information Act, which we helped get through in 1974, by the American Civil Liberties Union. Here's what the Times said. Quote, "You can often tell if someone understands how wrong their actions are by the lengths to which they go to rationalize them. It took 81 pages of twisted legal reasoning to justify President Bush's decision to ignore federal law and international treaties and authorize the abuse and torture of prisoners. 81 spine-crawling pages in a memo that might have been unearthed from the dusty archives of some authoritarian regime and has no place in the annals of the United States. It is must-reading for anyone who still doubts whether the abuse of prisoners were rogue acts rather than calculated policy." End quote. That memo was written days before the invasion of Iraq on March 14th. And that was the memo that not only said that Bush's regime could torture, but had a legal argument as to how Bush and Cheney and others could escape accountability if some prosecutor decided to enforce the criminal laws, the War Crimes Act of 1996, based on the violation of the Geneva Convention. Now, most national security experts in interrogation say that torture doesn't work. It makes the torture tell you what you want to hear, even if it's false. Torture, of course, boomerangs on our soldiers when they are caught by their opponents. Torture leads down a path from which there is really no boundary. Torture debases the torturers. Torture debases our country. The FBI has claimed it is against torture for those functional reasons. And the Army Field Manual prohibits torture for those functional reasons, along with some, shall we say, non-functional rationales about what the torture does to the torturer. So we have 5 categories now. I continue with my letter to Chairman Conyers. In 2005, a plurality of the American people polled declared that they would favor impeachment of President Bush if it was shown that he did not tell the truth about the reasons for going to war in Iraq. Well, it's overwhelming documentation of that. There were no weapons of mass destruction. There was no connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. They were mortal enemies. There was no threat by this tottering dictator over a dilapidated army that wouldn't fight for him to threaten his neighbors, 3 of whom were much more powerful than him. But when you see the lies, the fabrications of Bush and Cheney is on automatic. He still says some of these things. He's almost like a cartoon character, except that he's done such damage to so many innocent people.